And at this point, I'm very happy to be able to hand the presentation over to our wonderful design lead, landscape architect Mary Margaret Jones from Hargraves Associates. And before we do that, I just want to say, recognize Senator Champion here. Bobby Joe Champion's here from the Senate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. I'm Mary Margaret Jones, Senior Principal at Hargraves Associates. I want to give a nod to my colleagues, Gavin McMillan, Mary Lidecker, wherever she is, partners in crime here. So I'll dive right in because we have a lot to talk about this evening. We'll start with what we've learned in the public engagement, and then we will show you some alternative approaches. Then we'll break into group discussion, just like last time, and then ask each of the tables to report back. So we need to be very efficient with our time tonight, because we're very happy there are lots of people here. So public engagement, this is the Survey Monkey. You've all seen it. We asked you to give us your top 3 in each of these categories, from recreation to performance and events, to education and interpretation, to special features. Not only are we pleased with the number of responses, it's pretty interesting to see where people live. Vast majority live within 5 miles of the Commons, or where they work. Vast majority live within 5 miles, or work within 5 miles of the Commons. That's pretty interesting. And these are the top 4. We went ahead and charted the top 4 in each of those categories, because after the top 4, it drops off and they all become more equal. But it's sort of interesting to see the top 4. So in recreation, walking, jogging, trails, picnic, barbecue, casual games, ice skating. That was sort of interesting. In performances and events, music, farmers markets, flowers markets, outdoor movies, art festivals. In education interpretation, outdoor classes, sustainability, and environmental education. And then historic interpretation. So that was pretty interesting to see. And then special features, urban gardens, restaurant, cafe, beer garden, and urban gardens, great lawn, and public art. So what we like about these responses is that they're very civic-minded. They're very sort of big ideas. We also asked you to tell us about your favorite urban park in Minneapolis. And the interesting thing about that is there's not really an urban park, a true urban park on that list, and that's because there's really not one in Minneapolis. So we learned something from this list, and then your favorite urban park anywhere, and certainly those are great examples. This is what we call our thought cloud. So the size of the word represents the number of times it was mentioned in the Survey Monkey. And we love this thought cloud because this is a perfect mandate for what we hope the Commons will be. Public, open, park, green, friendly, accessible, couldn't be better. So these are pictures from the last public meeting, and you may have the same kinds of things happening tonight with various ways of getting your input. And we took the input from the last public meeting. So this is not necessarily the Survey Monkey, this is from the last public meeting. We took all the things that you wrote down and we categorized them. There's 6 categories. The first 3 you see here: flexible, welcoming, inclusive, distinctly Minneapolis. And again, the size of the words beneath represent the number of times it was mentioned. So again, really great feedback. I seem to remember that the sitting on blankets was anything you can do on a blanket. That's what one table wanted. Anything you can do on a blanket. 4 seasons. You know, it's very important here that we think about the fact that this needs to work all year long in the 4 seasons. Connection. And this is something that people are very aware of. This isn't just about this site. It's about leveraging this site and the other public realm of sites to form a system in the city that benefits the whole city. And then destination, creating a place that has fun things to do and that will bring people to the Commons. So we started with goals at the beginning of the last public meeting. We put them back up, slightly modified to include some of the things that we learned, not greatly modified, but embellished really by the things we learned in the last public meeting. So we want this to be inclusive, open to all, active and respite. Councilman Fry talked about that. High performance has to work well. Sustainability has all kinds of aspects to it, from social sustainability to environmental sustainability. It needs to be a catalyst for change and adaptable to change. And it, most of all, needs to be beautiful and iconic destination, and it needs to be of this place. So, we'll talk about the alternative approaches. And again, Peter said it, but I want to say it again. We're not looking for a vote. Of course, if you like one, say so. But what we're mostly looking for is what you like about each of the four. Because we purposely chose sort of alternative approaches in order to elicit response. We did it thinking about the context of the parks and public realm that surround us. Remembering that we have other features around us, we don't need to necessarily duplicate. We can't do everything on this 4.2 acres. Some things are being done other places, so how can we complement, how can we contrast, how can we add to? We look to history on this site. There's a great amount of history on this site, but there's also a great history of park planning in Minneapolis. So we look at the proposed plan from 1883 by Cleveland, and it's pretty amazing to think about ourselves within that context. We also think about the environmental conditions of the site and the fact of Minneapolis. Now, this is one of the things that I always find interesting. You have a lot of sun. I mean, I lived in San Francisco in my lifetime. San Francisco doesn't have as much sun as you have. But alternatively, you have some pretty cold temperatures and warm temperatures as well. You have a fairly typical precipitation model, but you also have snow. So these are things that cause us to think about what to do, how to do it throughout the year. You've got some pretty significant northwest winds that come across the site that we want to block to the best that we can, but you've got some nice southeast breezes that we might want to capture to the extent that we can. You've got a nice sunny site, and this is partly because of just the nature of the streets that surround it and the nature of the buildings to the south, which tend to be lower. The Armory will be there, and it's lower, and then the County Services Building has a low portion. So the site gets a lot of sun, good sun, which is great. Now, we think about sustainability, and we think about the way one measures environmental sustainability and environmental change. We think about what the site is now. It's mostly impervious. We will be transforming that to mostly pervious. We will be making connections, and we will be making public realm and open space. We can treat stormwater like we did in this park that we did in Portland. We can choose materials that are permeable and robust. We can use plantings that are native, and we can, these are solar panels on Cafe in a park in Houston. We can use energy. We want it to be about health and wellness, education and awareness, operations and programming, and maintenance. We need to consider all of those things. So these are our 4.2 acres that we control. The western block, about 1.8 acres, the eastern block, about 2.4 acres. But as we talked about last time, this is what is perceived to be the public realm. And this is really the public realm that we need to consider. So we consider the streets, and we consider the connection to the stadium and beyond in terms of connections. We think about these kinds of connections. We think about the importance of the street grid and the connections along that street grid and how they can, honoring the urban grid helps make an active urban place if you do it right. We have the LRT, of course, we have bus lanes, and we have the Skyway. So we have many forms, and bike lanes, we have many forms of connections that we want to tap into. To that end, we want to talk about the streets a little bit. This is existing Portland, existing Fourth, and existing Fifth. And there are ways that they will change for the better. Portland will get significantly narrower and only 2 lanes of traffic and a generous bike lane. 5th Street, this drive lane directly adjacent to the park will become a generous bike lane and not a drive lane at all. And we just learned that on 4th Street, not only will we have parking on the park side of 4th Street, there will be parking on the north side of 4th Street and not a counterflow bus lane. So these are all really good news for the Commons, all helping us sort of make this a pedestrian-dominated place and not a car-dominated place. Now, there are ways we can treat Portland. We want, on a day-to-day basis, to make it very clear and very safe that you're crossing at the corners, because there will be those 2 lanes of traffic southbound on day-to-day. But during many times, Portland will be closed for events, community events, or other kinds of events, and we want people to feel that the park connects across Portland, and there's various ways of doing that. This is an example of a street in Seattle where there are no curbs, and the design of the plaza extends straight across the street. Sometimes there's cars on that street, sometimes there's not, and it is closed to cars for festival-type use. In this case, the cars are regulated, if you will, by planters or bollards or other things. And this is one of our projects in Baton Rouge, where there are curbs. That's a curb, and there's a curb on this side, but the pedestrian paving extends across the street to the other side, claiming the street as part of the pedestrian realm and making it feel integral to the plaza in that case. We also think about our edges and the variety of uses that surround us. Great urban parks have lots of doorknobs, what we call doorknobs, around them, meaning lots of activity. So we know that with the Wells Fargo project underway, that there will be residential along 4th Street, there will be some retail and commercial along 4th Street, which is good news. The Ryan Company's project here, the residential project there, will have retail at its corner. We don't know for sure the future of the Armory. We can hope that it will be a synergistic set of uses with the park. County services, of course, and the stadium, of course, and future development there. And then the LRT, the fact that there will be no cars on 5th between Park and Chicago, but there will be the LRT. So we think about those edges, and we think about what that means for what we want to put in the park. We want great parks like this, good urban commons spaces like this, have some amount of destination, food and beverage, public bathrooms, and support facility within the park itself. It's important that the park have a certain amount of oversight, if you will, and amenity, if you will, that is part of the public realm. Because there will be lots around us that will be supporting the activity of the park, but it's within the private development, private realm venue. So we want to make sure that we complement that in the park. So think about where, you'll see alternatives for where such a facility might go. I love this diagram because it really speaks to what we are constantly striving toward, which is connections to the river and downtown east and this growing neighborhood. Every time I come, it's more full of life. The connections to the government district of downtown and to downtown. Connections to Elliott Park and the neighborhood that has existed for years and years. And then connections not only to the stadium, but east to the university. So again, these corridors, these streetscape corridors, as they come to the park and become part of the public realm, are very important. So here are the 4 approaches. Like I said, at this point, we're thinking about what are different framework of ideas, different parties, if you will, different approaches that we could investigate. And where might they take us? What might they lead to, and how do we feel about them? So we want to do that investigation with you. So we thought about the first one being all about contrast, meaning the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc being very, very different. Then we thought about connecting and contrasting, so making them different, but making connections, physical connections and programmatic connections that link them. Then we thought about a connection that is more a gradient, where it's something at this end and gradually transitions to something at the other end. You may remember last time we talked about a kind of more passive end and a kind of more active end and a gradient between. Or, fourthly, we thought about, well, what if we pretend the street's not there at all and just completely unite the 2 blocks? And think about that as a different way of looking at it. So, for each approach, you're going to see a cartoon diagram like this, and then you'll see a more illustrative plan. So I'll start with the cartoon diagram, and I'll give you a little bit of a legend on this, tell you what this all means. So then I wanted to do it every time, but you'll see some of these things appear on every approach. First of all, you'll see the idea of a promenade on both 4th Street and 5th Street. Promenade. Somebody asked me, what does that mean? Can you walk on a promenade? That's what it's all about. It's a big, generous, beautiful, tree-lined sidewalk, but with things along it, landscape as part of it. You'll see an open lawn. You'll see a great lawn in every scheme, but expressed quite differently. you'll see program zones in every scheme, but in different locations. And the program zones are, think of them as outdoor rooms, without walls and ceilings, but outdoor rooms defined by paving types, or some of them might be soft underfoot, there might be landscape in some of them, not in others, places to do a variety of things that are scaled for intimate settings or for festival settings. Then you'll see play, you'll see water features, and you'll see a C for cafe, but think of cafe as a pavilion. It's about shade, it's about administration support for the park, it's about a place to get your bocce balls, it's about a place to maybe rent things. And in every one, you'll see us identify in the Ryan companies in this corner their plans for a 2,000 square foot cafe. So you see that as part of the mix. And then in every scheme, you'll see Portland and Park, the indication that they should be treated very differently and incorporated into the public realm as much as possible. And then you'll see the idea of these white lines, or the idea of a tipped up set of terraces, slightly elevated in terms of like in a berm, in the side of a berm, so that you can view over the Great Lawn. So you can see, sorry, just to talk about this one in particular for a minute, you see just by these drawings how different this block is from this block. This block being very whimsical, very organic, flowing, and the other block, this one being more rectilinear, more flexible, more open, set up maybe more for events. So very much contrasting. So think of play as part of an environmental experience, and think of a water feature as part of a more environmental experience. And think of this, in this case, the pavilion being on the high point of the site. So I just want to say, when you're out there, it feels flat, but in fact, this side of the site is 8 to 9 feet higher than this side of the site. It's big enough so you don't perceive that as a steep slope at all, but it works for us in some ways. And by putting a cafe pavilion here, it might, if we did a second level, it might actually give you some pretty good views. So this is a plan that renders that, so that you see it a little more illustratively. So in this case, we're also thinking that the 5th Street promenade is not only where we would put the pavilion, but also where we might put the program garden zones, so that you have a lot of program on 5th Street in this scenario. We're thinking of this side of the park having, you see this as a sort of serpentine landform, and you see a couple of hills, so a picnic area, and a water feature that weaves through those hills. So this is very playful, very child-oriented, or kids of all ages oriented. And then you see the Great Lawn, and you see the program rooms that are set up in a kind of rectilinear way that sets up perfectly for tents, our bocce courts, our ping pong tournaments, our curling tournaments, whatever it might be. These are not yet beautiful renderings. We will be doing beautiful renderings before we're back in late May. What we've done for this time is to show you 3D models, what we call 3D models. So just to begin to give you a sense of the volumetric qualities of the various schemes, approaches, and the kind of spatial conditions of the various approaches. This is looking toward the stadium. So you see, actually what you see is the art piece that's part of the light rail station there. And you can see a very, very different character between those two blocks. And then looking in the other direction from the stadium toward downtown. Now, these are just images to evoke what I'm saying. They aren't exactly what I mean, because we're designing something here that's specific for here, and we'll show you renderings next time specific, but just to give you an idea. So when I talk about a water feature that's more of the landscape, this is a project actually in Japan, not our project, but it's pretty cool to look at the idea of creating some small hills and having cooling mist in the summer, or even some small jets of water, bubblers coming out from those hills. Or even for the shoulder season, spring and fall, maybe it's a warm fog. So that you can imagine it sort of being a place that you might want to come to in fall and spring. The Great Lawn and the kinds of things that can happen on the Great Lawn. And then the idea of a pavilion, in this case on a plaza. And it's about shade, it's about light, it's about restrooms, and all kinds of possibilities. Food trucks, which could be along the 4th Street edge. Places to sit outside and eat or hang out. In the winter, maybe there's a temporary ice rink that comes in. And then in those outdoor program rooms, as I was mentioning before, imagine setting up various kinds of events, like you see here in New York, this ping pong event. Now, we also like to test how one might set up a festival. So this is what we know of festivals and what we know might be a good way of doing a festival on the site, testing it on the site. So you start with a stage, and you start with a great lawn that in this case could easily be 6,000 people. But you want it to be also a place for day-to-day play. So it works for all the kinds of events and uses that might be imagined at this site, from outdoor movies to game day. A food beverage event here, a big tent here. Small tents, 10 by 10 tents are very typical for art festivals and markets and food festivals. So the promenade and the rhythm of the trees is set up perfectly to set up these 10 by 10 tents. Or sometimes you put two together for 10 by 20 tents. In the outdoor program rooms, think about cultural festival and tents, maybe a larger tent. This would be flat, so you can set up a larger tent. Maybe around the children's play area and the pavilion, you set up children's activities, information kiosk, maybe hide the porta potties behind the berm along the park. There are many ways of setting up festivals and events on the site. We're testing and showing, for example, purposes, one way one might do it. Okay, so now let's move to number 2, contrast and connect. So still different characters between the two, different programming between the two, but they begin to connect. And one of the major connection devices that you see here is this fabulous shape, which we see as evoking a lake, but actually being a plaza with a little bit of water on it. So that the cafe pavilion is seemingly floating on this plaza of water. And on that plaza of water, you could have, say, in each of these lobes, you could have bubblers or misters or small jets to entice children of all ages. So play and gardens in this area. The program zones on this scenario being part of 4th Street. So imagining more activity along 4th Street, complementing the activity that will be happening when the developments happen across the street. So making this a real kind of urban buzz of a street. And thinking of the 5th Street Promenade perhaps as being more of a place of oasis and a place that will welcome the people coming from the neighborhood to the south and the offices to the south. The open lawn, the great lawn, performing the same way, but perhaps having a slightly different expression. And the bleachers, or the terraces, performing in the same way, but again, having a slightly different expression. So you see a rendered plan of that. And I think one of the things we like about this scheme is the way it jumps Portland and puts the cafe pavilion right on Portland, therefore really sort of embracing that as a connected device and not a separating device. The Great Lawn, again, working similarly, but taking on a little bit more character. This could be woodland gardens, buffering, of course, this residential development, but connecting to the retail in the corner, the cafe at the corner, play area, and the urban rooms along 5th Street, as I said. So, looking toward the stadium. This is flat. One of the things about this plaza, this fountain plaza, is that when the fountain is turned off, when the water is turned off, it becomes a plaza for multiple uses. So it has a lot of flexibility. And the idea of the pavilion seemingly floating on it. And then looking toward downtown. And you can see how the berm here is sort of tilted in this case, looking not quite so dead west, which might be a good idea. So there aren't any exact examples of what we're talking about because this is a new idea, I think, but this is a pavilion in Paris, a cafe pavilion in Paris, where there is a wet plaza, a fountain plaza. This is one in Oklahoma City. And you can see how people, even in their workday clothes, might want to take off their shoes and paddle across it. Our little kids will find the small jets and fountains. And in the wintertime, this is in Cambridge, this is a curling festival. And there's a food truck nearby that sponsors these fire pits, and they sell marshmallows, and you can toast marshmallows while you have your curling tournament. It's very fun. I've been there. So think about a great lawn in the summer, a great lawn in the winter. Think about sort of meadow grasses, maybe around the edges in some of these urban gardens, And think about the shoulder seasons when the grass isn't necessarily green, but you still have events happening. And then we've done the same thing with this game, this approach, seeing how you might occupy it during festivals, community events, large and small. And you can see that perhaps this one, more than the one you just saw, allows for festival use perhaps a little bit more freely because it's more flat and you've got this plaza that you can use. Food, beverage, tent, some of the same ingredients, but maybe a little bit more of the family, children, and art stuff along 4th Street. And by the way, the food truck festival might be 4th Street, it might be 5th Street. Those are things that we're still trying to understand better. Okay, so then we come to one that we call Connect. And we've done 2 different things with Connect. One is thinking of the Great Lawn just spilling right across, and thinking of the water feature just spilling right across. Not actually, but seemingly. Now, the other thing we've done differently about this one is to think about the western block being perhaps more natural. And in this case, saying, what if this is a water body? So a water body year-round. Could be frozen for ice skating in the winter, could be model boat ponds in the summer, could be learn to kayak in the summer. You could have environmental play along it that could be about exploration, learning about wetland vegetation, for instance. Kids looking at polywogs, that kind of thing. And then in this case, the program zones being along Park Avenue. So a slightly different way of thinking about the festival setup and outdoor program zones sort of extending the space in this direction. And in this case, the pavilion being on the 4th Street Promenade. So more a part of the activity of the 4th Street Promenade. And it could look something like this. Again, play, sort of trailing along, being part of a lake, a bridge over a lake, a cafe pavilion, a wetland garden at the downhill side of the lake, bridging across or jumping across. The outdoor rooms here, we could have one of them as a plaza with a small water feature that's more like jets, so that you could play in water in this scenario as well. No terraces in this one, more of a flat condition across in this one. And again, a 3D view, and not yet a design for a pavilion, a placeholder for a pavilion. Luckily, we have Vincent James Architects Associates on our team who can do a beautiful pavilion. And I should also mention our other local partner, Tom Whitlock from Damon Barber, who's here tonight, and many people from that office. We're so thrilled to have them as local partners. And we have a much bigger local team as well. Sorry, I meant to mention that from the beginning, of experts helping us, and we're very pleased to have them all working with us. So looking toward the stadium, looking toward downtown. And then, so the idea of a water body and the idea of a spray fountain as well. Again, the Great Lawn and how it hosts day-to-day events and how it hosts performances with lots of people in attendance. In this case, a pavilion that might be along the promenade as a linear shade device, not just a destination. In winter, this is actually in Bryant Park in New York, but the idea of pavilions put up in the winter for various events. The idea of the wetland gardens, that lower right-hand image, and the idea of boardwalks, possibly through those wetland gardens. And then finally, play that's about exploration of the environment, not about swing sets and slides. This one probably sets up the least, in terms of the western block, accommodates big events probably the least of the 4, just by the nature of the water body, which would be there year-round. Still works great, but just a little bit differently. So then we come to Unite, and we thought, well, what if we thought of this as one place uniting the 2 blocks? So with one expression that's more centrally focused. So spanning Portland with the open lawn, and then making it more inwardly focused, and the program zones all along 4th Street, with a pavilion on the green, and a play area on the green, and an interactive water feature on the green. So much more about a central green, if you will, which could look something like this. So program rooms, program zones all along 4th Street, some terraces at this corner. It's sort of a turned corner. One thing I should have mentioned on every one of these that I will mention now, This is the bridge that is being planned that will go over Chicago and over the light rail tracks and connect to this block. And so that connection will then extend right down the promenade on 4th Street. So we see that as a very important connection. This will also be a very important connection of people crossing and crossing Park at the street. And so you see that one rendered, beginning to be rendered, 3D modeled at least, looking toward the stadium and looking toward downtown. So you see a very different kind of character, very much more inward focus. You must remember the idea of using the Great Lawn at night. We want this to be an active and attractive place at night. The idea of urban gardens and what they could be, and there's actually lots of programming embedded in those gardens. There's a big lawn for putting up a tent. There's a place to put up a market under trees. There's lots going on there. The idea of a fountain that when turned off is a plaza, and then a place to set up temporary events, a place to be when it's cold, a shade device on the green, festival lighting or seasonal lighting, and then everyday uses in the program zones. And in this case, so you see in this case, a big tent could go on this western block, and then you can still have music and performances and outdoor movies on the eastern block, with lots of sort of activities along 4th and some also along 5th. So those are the 4 approaches. We'd like to hear what you like about each one. I know it's a lot to absorb, but you have them at your tables, and there they are looking toward the stadium, and there they are looking toward downtown. So like last time, we're going to enter into a group discussion. So the tables are going to talk about these. We will give you an alert at 5 minutes, and then 3 minutes, and then 3 minutes, and then 3 minutes. To remind you that you need to move on. Don't spend all your time on team approach 1. Be sure you touch on all 4 approaches if you can. We'll ask each table, like last time, to have one person, one of you, report back your top, very summarized notions. But we will then ask you to give us the paper on which you've written down everything. So a short summary tonight, and then we will look at what you write down. So, anything else I need to say, Peter? Adam? Good? Okay. All right. Have a good time. We'll be back.